What's up YouTube? KS Gun Guy here. Thanks for joining me today as always. So I've been spending a fair amount of time with Glocks lately. If you've been watching the channel for any period of time, you've noticed that I've been wheeling in a lot of Glocks. And I had spent a fair amount of time with other manufacturers like Sig Sauer and Walther and HK, CZ, the list goes on. But I wanted to spend some time getting back to my roots, I guess, a little bit, because for a long time, I will admit, I was a bit of a Glock fanboy. Now, I'm not really anymore. I like all guns the same, and I don't think there's a best gun or anything like that. I just enjoy shooting, and I enjoy guns. But it's been fun to get back into Glocks, and one of the big advantages of Glocks is the aftermarket support and all the different components that you can do, and you can do yourself. So today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of trigger systems here, and I do have a couple of Glocks in front of me. This is the Vickers Tactical. Of course, it is unloaded. And the new Glock FS, or front serration version, also unloaded. I do have unloaded magazines in both. I'll get rid of those here in just a moment since we're testing triggers. But I've got a couple of triggers in these guns, and so I've got the Overwatch Precision TAC trigger here, or TAC trigger, and then I've got an Apex Tactical flat trigger. So both of these are flat trigger systems because I feel like those are relatively equal, and I have noticed some things about each one, some advantages and disadvantages. Wanted to share those with both of you. Now, as far as any other internals in the guns, they are identical. I do have identical ZEV race connectors in both, but otherwise all of the springs and all the other components are exactly the same. Now, you could make an argument that this is built off of a Gen 3 platform, the Vickers is, but since they both have aftermarket triggers, we don't have the tiny little bump on the trigger bar that Gen 4s are known for, and I'll wheel in a picture of one of those here in just a moment. But again, these are the same, so that should make for some pretty equal comparisons, because we'll take a look at the triggers and the features of both of them, and of course pull them a couple of times, maybe test them on the gauge here. This won't be a terribly long video, but just to give you an idea of a couple of different options out there. So the Overwatch Precision, and I have featured this trigger before, actually in a Glock MOS build I did a long time ago on the channel. Be sure to check that guy out there for more in-depth reviews on just the Glock MOS build in general. But the Apex flat trigger is kind of this is the TAC again, so it's not a traditional flat trigger. It actually has a little bit of a protrusion down at the very bottom of it, a little bit of a hook outward to help keep your finger in place. It's one of the features that I really like about this trigger itself. Now, you'll notice that it does have the standard safety dingus, and it is aluminum. Now, one thing I noticed about this when I was first testing it on the MOS, as I was pulling the trigger, the safety dingus tended to rub up against the frame just a tiny bit. So I actually took a file and just shaved off, I mean, hardly any material at all, but just enough to make it work a little bit better for me. And it's partly because of the style of shooting that I do. I tend to wrap my finger in the trigger guard a little bit more. I don't use the pad of my finger. It is what it is. I just shoot a little bit better that way. It's a little bit more comfortable. So technique aside, that's how I do it. So to make that work for me, I just made that minor modification there. You don't really have to do that out of the box, and it's not a knock on the trigger. But in terms of how it shoots or how it pulls, so basically the TAC trigger is really up against the wall right away. So there's no uptake whatsoever, which is something that's really nice. But it also means that there's no preparation for when you're shooting. So depending on your shooting style, it might take you a little while to get used to the fact that that trigger is basically ready to go when you depress that safety dingus. And once you do, you do move through the trigger. Now, there's a fair amount of crawl or creep, whatever you want to say, as you move through that trigger, but that's pretty standard with Glocks. There's nothing necessarily special about that, and especially with OEM springs in there, that's pretty normal. And then we get to our reset, and that reset is pretty short, and then it travels back out just about a millimeter and a half or so. Again, I'm not the best judge of distance, but I'd say that's roughly accurate. So we'll do this again. Once again, we are right up against the wall, and then we have our break. Now, I will tell you, it's very smooth. Now, that connector helps a little bit with that as well. I just prefer those connectors, but it is certainly a very good pull. and then it moves back out to the brake and back to your reset. Now again, because of the style of shooting that I have, some aftermarket triggers I find tend to rub my finger right there, and after a while I'll develop a blister. For whatever reason, this trigger does not do it, whether I use the pad of my finger or I wrap it around, again like I normally do. For whatever reason, this trigger really seems to work well for my style, and it doesn't give me that blister, which is really nice. So that's the tack trigger. Again, we'll come back to the trigger gauge and pull that trigger here a couple times in just a moment. But now we move on to the Apex flat trigger. Now this is a slightly different trigger system here. Once again, it is a flat trigger, and it does have a little bit of a protrusion down at the very bottom, once again, to help guide your finger. And it's all aluminum. It does have the safety dingus like you would expect there. Now one thing I found, once again, with my shooting style, regardless of whether I was using the pad of my finger or even my full grip like I normally would with wrapping around, as I was shooting this, I did notice that I was getting a little bit of that rub and that blister starting to form there. So for whatever reason, the physics of this trigger just don't connect with me as well. Not to say it's not a bad trigger, it really is a very good one, but I just noticed that. So we'll go ahead and pull this. Now you'll notice that there actually is a little bit of uptake with this, and then you do get to your wall, and then you pull through, and there's your brake. Once again, I mean, it's pretty standard for a Glock trigger to have that pull through the wall into the brake. And let me get my finger out of the way here. And there's your reset, and it's a very nice reset for sure. And then you go back to the start. So once again, we've got our pull, and it's a nice smooth pull for sure. And we get to our wall, and there's our brake. And there's our reset. So both very good triggers, and frankly, they pull about the same, which is really nice. One thing I like about the tack trigger a little bit more is it's at the wall, it's ready to go. There isn't quite as much pull through as there is with the Apex, if that makes sense. So let's test these a couple of times on the trigger gauge and see how they both do. I'm only going to do this a couple of times and just kind of see how they pull. Since they're flat, they should both pull relatively consistently, I hope. Now I am pulling from the bottom of the trigger, and that's to catch that hook, but I'm going to do that with both triggers, so once again it should be consistent, even if that's not necessarily the best trigger pull technique. So I'm getting 4 pounds, 0.6 ounces, which is pretty fantastic, especially since the only other thing in either of these guns, again, is that Zev race connector. We'll do this again. And I'm not using my finger to do anything other than keep the bar in place. I'm not putting any pressure on it, just so you know. So 4 pounds, 0.2 ounces. We'll do this one more time for the sake of consistency. I don't like to do this very many times. I think it's ungodly boring to watch this. So 3 pounds, 15.2 ounces. So really pretty consistent right around the 4 pound mark, which is pretty fantastic considering I don't have any aftermarket springs or anything like that. And those springs tend to really make a considerable difference when we talk about trigger pull. So here's our Apex. Once again, I will pull from the bottom using the finger only to guide the bar. So 4 pounds, 0.1 ounces. Once again, it's fantastic for aftermarket triggers. If I can get that in there. 4 pounds, 3.3 ounces. We'll do that. Again, that was not the best trigger pull. My hands tend to shake sometimes. Unfortunately, that's just naturally how I'm built. So 4 pounds, 4.3 ounces. So still coming in just a hair over 4 pounds, which is pretty good. Standard stock Glock triggers fall somewhere in the 5.5 to 6.5 pound mark, generally speaking. So both do a really good job from that standpoint. Now, from a value standpoint, they are priced a little bit differently. I did get the Apex trigger, and it actually came with a trigger bar and a safety plunger as well. I've not put either of those in it. I haven't tested those yet. I really wanted to focus on the trigger itself, and I like those Zev bars. I just think they do a really good job. But alone, if you do just the trigger bar and the trigger shoe itself, you're going to look at right around $100 for that, or at least on eBay from what I've found. Now, the Overwatch Precision trigger, these are a little bit more more expensive here. These are going to run somewhere in the $130 to $150 mark, depending on where you can find them. I've had a couple buddies tell me that periodically they find deals on various websites, getting it a little bit closer to $100, but again, just a little bit more expensive. Now, one thing that's kind of unique about the Overwatch Precision trigger that I don't believe is true, at least from my reading with the Apex, the Overwatch actually features an NP3 coating, so it's a naturally slick coating. It keeps it a little bit slicker, and it also makes it a little bit easier to clean, which I like. I've noticed that that actually really does help a little bit. Now, the Apex was lightly polished, not very polished, but lightly polished, so I gave it a little bit of a polish job just to clean it up a little bit, so it's a little shinier now, but still very good out of the box. So at the end of the day, which one do I like better? For my particular shooting, for me, I do prefer the Overwatch Precision trigger. I think it's a fantastic trigger. It's a good build. Now, again, I've had to scrape a little bit of material away from that safety dingus. That's on me, not on the trigger so much. I like the Apex too. It feels good, and it certainly is very consistent. For whatever reason, for my style of shooting, it just isn't quite maybe as comfortable as the Overwatch. But this isn't so much about saying one is better than the other or anything like that. Just a couple of different options to present to you. I'd love to hear your feedback, either if you have experience on either of these two triggers or maybe some other aftermarket triggers, because there are a lot of them and a lot of really good quality and really popular ones. So I'd love to hear your feedback on that, because I may check them out based upon what you guys tell me. I learn a lot from you guys. And otherwise, thanks so much for joining me today. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and I will talk to you next time. Thanks.